So welcome back for our last session today. I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Allan, who is Emerita and Burlington Northern Foundation Professor of Asian Studies at Dartmouth College. She is currently a visiting scholar at Berkeley. She is the editor of Early China and chair for the Society of the Study of Early China. She has published extensively, and I'm just gonna cite some of her most recent publications, like Buried Ideas, Legends of Abdication and Ideal Government in Early Chinese Bamboo's Leap Manuscripts, and then of course The Hare and the Sage, Dynastic Legend in Early China, or The Shape of the Turtle, Myth, Art, and Cosmos in Early China. And one of my favorites is The Way of Water and Sprouts of Virtue, so I definitely have to cite that one. Well, and today, of course, the theme of our talk for our workshop that closes so well our day of work, it's The Origins of Chinese Political Philosophy, from the Son of Sky / Heaven, tianzi, to the Father and Mother of the People, Minzi Fumu. We will have first the talk, and then we will have some time for discussion and questions at the end. And with no further delay, Sarah, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to many scholars. I've noticed just as I've been listening this morning, there's so many people that I've never communicated with before, so it's a delight. The title of my talk is The Origins of Chinese Political Philosophy, from the Son of Heaven, tianzi, to the Father and Mother of the People. And the conference is called Beyond Orientalism. As I understand Orientalism, it's the projection of one's own conceptual viewpoint, a worldview, onto other cultures, be that affirmative or negative. It obliterates the way that they think about themselves. Now, we all recognize that political philosophy reflects cultural history and is a response to particular historical circumstances. Now, the question is, how do you get beyond Orientalism? How do you try to understand how a culture thought about itself in the past, or even how it thinks about itself today? In other words, how to understand its own rationale. Clearly, one can never do this perfectly. Nevertheless, I think that the most important or most effective way to do this is through language, especially metaphor, because language frames ideas and through theoretical argumentation. Meanings, of course, change in response to circumstances. So when we're looking at language, we can't assume that that language doesn't change over time. Now, today, I want to discuss evolving ideas concerning rulership from around 1300 BCE, that is from the late Shang Dynasty, to around 300 BCE, that is to say when in the Warring States period, including but not going beyond the recently discovered Chu script manuscripts. Obviously, this is a very long period of time, and I can't do this perfectly, and I will be relying heavily on previous work that I've done, and engaging therefore in generalizations that I don't normally do. So what I want to do is to discuss some terminology that everybody knows, everybody's familiar with. I want a set of related terms to do with rulership. I won't translate them now because I'm going to discuss their meaning as we go on, and there is a problem with their changing meanings. So the terms are Wang Di, Shang Di, Tian, Tianzi, Tianxia, Tianming, Minzi Fumu, and I think that these are terms, or Min Fumu, these are terms that everybody in the field is very well acquainted with, whether they're dealing with the Shang Dynasty or the Shang or early Western Zhou, or whether they're dealing with modern times. So I want to start with the Shang because that's the earliest period in which we have any kind of records. Now, very important, I think, not only understanding the Shang, but for understanding the foundation that was laid in that period for the rest of Chinese history is that their social and political organization was kinship-based. And that kinship-based lineage system was buttressed by religious belief. In other words, the Shang kings were not only a lineage, but we know from archaeology that the elite, at least, was all organized according to lineage. They have lineage cemeteries, but that lineage structure was buttressed by ancestor worship. In other words, the lineage was the religious group. And that has meant that, and lineages continued in changing relationships, but lineage family structure seen in terms of ancestors is the basis not only of Chinese religion, but it's been fundamental to China's conceptualization of human relationships. So in the Shang times, the king, who was called Wang, worshipped his own ancestors, and his own ancestors acted as a conduit to Shangdi. Shangdi was at the apex of a hierarchy that included ancestral and nature spirits. Now, here I want to make a comment about the translation of Shangdi. Shangdi, there are no totally satisfactory methods of translating it. I sometimes have used Lord on High, High Lord, Supreme Thearch. I object to the term God. I strenuously object to it. I consider that really a real example of Orientalism because it projects a conceptual view onto Chinese thought that is not accurate. In any case, he was at the apex. We don't really know very much about it, who Shangdi was, except that he was at the apex of this hierarchy. The term Di itself originally was a title for ancestors in the main line of descent. So when in oracle bones, when they offer ancestors through the royal main line of descent, they're called Di, and then they have the Tiangan, or the sun name, as I understand it. What Shangdi should be in that regard, I here think that Qiu Shigui's suggestion is the most likely. That is to say that Shangdi was understood as a progenitor of the main lineages, not just the Shang, but also some of the other main lineages. And therefore, this would be a projection to back, using the term Di in the same way that it's actually used in the oracle bones for other ancestors. In any case, Shang political power was legitimized by their superior ability to empower their ancestors and influence Shangdi through divination and sacrifice for the benefit of the ruler and his people. So the one point here is to remember is that family structure then becomes, from this time on, becomes the primary metaphor for understanding the nature of political power and responsibility. Now, I've hypothesized previously that the Xia was a Shang myth of a previous people. That is to say, the Shang royal lineage associated themselves with 10 suns, light, sky, birds, and the Xia with an earlier people associated with 12 moons, dark, dragons, etc. And I've argued that was from the shape of the turtle, well, myth of the Xia and then the shape of the turtle. But I've argued more recently that Shangdi then this was understood as the pole star, so that all of the ancestors were identified with celestial bodies. be that as it may, when the Western Zhou overthrew the Shang, they were different from the Shang in the fact that they overthrew an established state. The Shang grew up over a period of time. Their relationships with other peoples were varied depending upon the particular power relationship when they established whatever kind of power they had. The term Wang that was used by the Shang king was adopted by the Zhou king. It's not clear that Wang was an exclusive title for the Shang king. In fact, Ximixin has argued that the name Wang was used by the Shang king for other people than himself. But in Zhou times, Wang becomes the name that only the Zhou king uses. The highest power in this case is called Shangdi or Tian, and they're used exchangeably. What I think is behind this is that Tian referred to Shangdi or to Shangdi and all the other celestial spirits, which would be the ancestral spirits or the celestial bodies. That is to say, Tian was a euphemism for Shangdi, like we might say heaven when we mean God. And this I reject the idea that there were different high gods from different ethnicities. So then if Tian is equivalent to Shangdi, and Wang, in this scheme, the Wang becomes the tianzi, the son of sky heaven, and he rules over Tianshan. By implication, and as I'll discuss in a minute, the tianzi then is the father and mother of the people. That is to say, if you take the metaphor of family relations and the ruler is the son of sky heaven, then his role is a parental one to the people. And it's interesting that he's always called Minter Fumu. He's not Minter Fu. He's not the father of the people. He's the father and mother of the people. Now, at some time during the beginning of early on in the Western Zhou dynasty, and the idea of Tianming, the transfer of the mandate of sky heaven was formulated. And this is the reason that I mentioned previously my idea about the Xia being a myth of the Shang people, about a previous people to them. So essentially, this was historicized by the Western Zhou people. So then you get a sequence of the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties. And this, by implication, leads to an idea of dynastic cycle. In formulating this mandate, idea of a mandate of heaven, the Western Zhou rulers argued that the authority was given to their lineage by Tian in response to the personal behavior of the last Shang king. And this is important because it inserts a moral qualification for rulership. That is to say, in order to legitimize their rule to people that they needed to control, they argued that they had the moral qualification for rulership, and presumably this was for current political reasons. But what it means in the long run is that rule was no longer simply hereditary right. So once you get an idea of a dynastic cycle, even though it may have been a response at that time to their particular circumstances, that it makes a theory in which morality is an element of rulership. When exactly this idea was formulated is not clear. there's a great difficulty with any texts that are considered to be Western Zhou. You have some Shu and you have some Shi, and to what extent they're in the original form, and even if they did originate in Western Zhou, is always a problem. Nevertheless, there's some indication of the idea of morality, of a claim of legitimacy by the Western Zhou rulers in Western Zhou bronzes. So the earliest indication of an idea of Tianming, a mandate of heaven, is in the Hezun. And now, this was excavated in Baoji in 1963. It is very clearly a transitional style bronze, and this is important. If you notice, you see the flanges here. You see the taotie, the way the eyes are done, the eyebrows, and the horns are made. Very interestingly, in recent times, they've been able to match molds that come from Anyang to these bronzes that were discovered at Baoji. Some of these were in Taiwan, and some of them have been more recently discovered in Anyang. And Chinese scholars and Li Yongdi, who's now in Taiwan, have worked on these and have actually matched actual molds with bronzes found in Baoji. So I think this is interesting in thinking about why the Western Zhou need to make this kind of claim for legitimacy. The Shang had literate people, they had a massive bronze industry, and in order to take this over, as they in fact indicate in the Shangshu, they needed the cooperation of the Shang elite. And it's in that context that they made the argument, they make their argument. In the Hezun, it says when the king first moved his residence to Chengzhou, he reenacted the rites of King Wu and performed libations, sacrifices, starting with Tian. In the fourth month, the day being Shu, the king made an announcement to lineage descendants in the lofty chamber, saying, "Formerly your pious patriarchs were able to assist King Wen. Thereupon King Wen received this greater celestial mandate." Actually, that is missing. That's that hole that we saw in the mandate in the rubbing. King Wu, having conquered the great settlement Shang, made a courtyard announcement to Tian, saying, "I shall reside in this central city-state." This says Zhong and there's Huo, and that there's a debate about whether it should be Zhongguo or Zhongyu. And primarily in the West, a lot of scholars have started taking this as Yu rather than Guo. I think that's a mistake because you don't find the term Yu very much in Western Zhou or even spring and autumn texts. It's rather rare, whereas Guo is a much more common term. In any case, and govern the people from there. So the Min, he starts with Tian, and the inscription ends with his responsibility. Well, it doesn't end, this part ends, it goes on, to govern the Min. Now, if we take a somewhat later Western Zhou bronze, Kangwang or something like that, we have the Dayu Ding, and this is one of the most famous inscriptions. Now, here we find evidence that the accusation of immoral conduct, and specifically the accusation of drinking too much, was already there in the Western Zhou. So it was the 9th month when the king was at Zhongzhou. And then we go a bit further. King Wu, having succeeded Wen, formed a state, or whatever, however one's going to translate Bang, and expelled the evil, Bi Che Tu. Now, whether this is supposed to be, it's possible this is evil persons. It's possible that this is evil in a sort of general sense. It's hard to know, that it's not clear, but it's clearly a moral term. And then he spread his beneficence to the four quadrants and greatly reformed the behavior of the people. So he zheng jue min, and so correcting the people is what he does after he expels evil. And then it goes on and says, we have heard that Yin letting go of their mandate was due to the Yin peripheral lords and all the Yin central authorities being mired in drink, causing their troops to perish. This accusation of drunkenness is quite consistent. And I used to think, and people, other people have said too, that perhaps this was to do with the fact that the Shang used wine at the core of their ritual. The wine vessels, the gu and jue, were the core of Shang ritual offerings, and the zhou, it was gui and ding, which are food. And so maybe it's different between the two ethnicities. On the other hand, I also used to think that one shouldn't think too much about how individuals affect history. I think our current circumstances are showing us that, in fact, individuals can have great effect on the course of history, and immoral behavior by rulers can affect things. So it is quite possible that the last Shang ruler was a drunkard and did other bad things. In any case, immorality was taken here as a disqualification for ruling. So this moral qualification for ruling starts in the Western Zhou period. And it continues in the textual tradition. As Arthur Wright pointed out in 1964, there's a tradition of bad last kings being said to be drunken, licentious, swayed by women, and to enjoy cruelty, taking pleasure in cruelty, including in hunting, or especially in hunting for some reason. These are things that are always associated with the last kings of dynasties and are said to contribute to their fall. And this is found in the Shangshu as well. Here we find this trope that's continuous. The ancients had a saying, the hen should not call in the morning. If the king hen calls in the morning, it's the unraveling of the family. Now, as for Zhou, the Shang king, it's interesting that he's called king here. These are the words of the wife, his wife that he follows. So whether it's their wives or their concubines, this is something we hear about a lot. And we find in Shaogao, we cannot afford looking at the Sha and we cannot avoid looking at the Yin. And it goes on to say, Your Majesty has now succeeded to their mandate. With regard to these two state mandates, we also succeed to their merits. So he's saying, well, we are like them. And we are like them, like their first kings. We're succeeding to their gung, and then we can rule as they did. It's also, I don't have time to get into Da, but I will just say here that Da originally was something that was inherited from one's ancestors. And it's from that inheritance, that lineage role. In the bronzes, they say, you know, you got this Da from your ancestors. And then it's from that later on that it gets its meaning to do with moral virtue. Now, when the term Minzi Fumu originated, we can't be sure. But in this Bingongshu or Suigongshu vessel, this is not an excavated vessel. It was bought back from Hong Kong, and it has a very important inscription. It says, "Guy commanded you to spread out the earth, follow along the mountains, and make channels for the rivers." Many scholars have argued that this shows there was a Shah dynasty. That's not necessarily true. At this point, this could be simply an argument about the beginning of the world, a cosmogonic myth. But anyway, Qin makes the ruler he's Pei Xiang. In other words, he's a counterpart and he's going to perform the rites. And as I understand this last line, and as I punctuate it, because there's also argument about that, Mincheng Fumu, I think it means for the people he became father and mother. But that's something that can be argued about. Now, the problem with the idea of a dynastic cycle is that it breaks down in the spring and autumn period. It doesn't work then. There's a breakdown of central authority, and the states increase in power and begin to struggle with one another. There are also in this period changes in religious beliefs. In the 6th century BC, it's particularly evident in tombs, whereas the former sumptuary rules for burial no longer function. In other words, in the Western Zhou, they're not always, they change and they're not always perfectly abided by, but people of certain rank, they're buried with certain things, and so many Ding and so many Gui. These break down, and markers of personal identity begin to replace those of lineage status in tombs. And this reflects social changes. It reflects the rise of both the mercantile class and the literati. In terms of social change, you have a collapse of the hereditary aristocracy, that is the old Zhou lineages, the rise of the Shi class, and which is, as Yuri was talking about earlier, and the spread of literacy. And with the spread of literacy, one of the things that happens, I think, with the rise of the Shi class is with all these states, they all needed literate people to run the different states. And so you get many more people trained to read and write, but writing is now removed from a bureaucratic context. So we now know from these bamboo slips that people were writing things and circulating amongst themselves, and they weren't writing these things for their superiors. They were writing these things for other Shi. But the most important thing from my point of view here is there's a failure of the idea of a changing celestial mandate as an explanatory paradigm. That's because the idea of a mandate of heaven means you had a king and you overthrew that king. You had a lineage, and then you get a bad king, and then he can be overthrown. And then the mandate should change. But the Zhou king didn't have any power. In fact, no state had a great deal of power. So you couldn't overthrow a king and then have the mandate of heaven. The only way to have the mandate of heaven was to have either conquer or have allegiance of everybody in the world. We see this, with this, then you get the beginnings of argument about political philosophy. In other words, how are you going to get out of this situation? How are you going to have a king? Now, the mandate of heaven is not an answer. So you get the rise of political argument in these manuscripts that were circulating amongst themselves, and we also the philosophers that we see in the transmitted text. And at this time, you get the rise of a new historical paradigm that included pre-dynastic rulers who abdicated. So in the Western Zhou period, you had a dynastic cycle, a changing mandate of heaven, with 3 dynasties, hereditary dynasties, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou. They were all called Wang. The founding king was good, and the last evil king was overthrown. The historical paradigm in the Warring States period, which is formed sometime in the spring and autumn, is that you have 3 dynasties preceded by an era of sage kings who passed rule to other sages by abdication. So they were called Diyao, Dixuan, and Diyu. And Diyu was understood as the founder of the Xia dynasty, and so that was the first lineage. Notably, these pre-dynastic rulers are called diarchs or di, and that term is used specifically for people who pass rule by abdication. The evil sons of the pre-dynastic rulers were equated with the bad last kings of the dynastic cycle, so you still get a moral determinative for change of rule. Now, I've argued that this idea of abdication from sage to sage originated as a challenge to the assumption of hereditary rule, as Yuri has too. And this was one idea that people had, it never was put into practice, but was one idea that people had for how to get a good ruler if you in this kind of situation in which the mandate of heaven isn't working. Now, one point I would like to make here is that no ruler or thinker in early China or even in later China before they met with the West ever suggested the solution of a multi-state system. I make this point because many scholars in recent times, I think Victoria Hui was the first person to mention this, but have argued that China could have become like Europe after the Warring States period. There's no conceptual background for that. They didn't, and none of the states ever think of themselves as co-equal. Everybody assumes that you're going to have, that the only way you're going to get out of civil war is by having one ruler who rules Tianxia. That is the solution. They didn't think of, well, maybe we can all make an agreement and we can all live peacefully together. They did make agreements with one another, but those agreements and treaties that they made with one another were ways of blocking essentially the rise of Qin or the rise of other states. But there's no idea of a multi-state system, so it was never on the cards to have a multi-state system in China. And even in later periods, although the rule broke down, I think Edward Schaefer once mentioned that there was more time that China wasn't unified than it was unified. Nevertheless, in all of those periods of time, it was always assumed that the way that one got out of civil war was by unity. The Tang Yu Zhidao is one example of the bamboo manuscripts that argue for abdication. This idea was not was glossed over in the transmitted text because obviously rule by abdication was not a way that any lineage was going to want to promote. So it was the idea that this was something that happened in ancient times and not something that could happen afterwards became the kind of way that people thought of it. But now that we have the bamboo manuscripts, we can see that it was something that there were some people who were promoting as an alternative to lineage rule. So he says a way of Tang Yao and Yuxuan was to abdicate the rule and not monopolize its benefits. The kingship of Yao and Yuxuan benefited everyone under heaven and did not benefit them. And then it goes on, the zenith of the greatest humaneness is to benefit all under heaven and not derive benefit for oneself. What is called abdication refers to a ruler of superior virtue bestowing the rule on a worthy. So this is the idea of Xian, and the idea of Xian becomes the idea of a minister. So what happens and is that this promotion, and this is the same thing that Yuri was talking about earlier, the idea of a Xian and this class of people who are promoting themselves as the answer to everything become, if they're not going to be the rulers, they're at least going to be the ministers. So you have to have you have a moral imperative in this, but if it's not going to be passed ruler to ruler, then the idea is that the ruler must depend upon somebody who will be able to advise him about how to behave well. So the ruler is described as the father and mother of the people. This is first found in the Mozo, which is also the text that probably reflects most directly the idea of abdication as a system of government. And he says, thus sky, heaven, and the ghosts admired them, and them is these rulers, both Yao, Xuan, and Yu, Tang, Wen, and Wu. So Yao, Xuan, and Yu were equated with the first kings of the later dynasties and made them sons of sky heaven, made them tianzi, and took them as father and mother of the people. And the myriad people, giving them their allegiance, praise them as sage kings. It continues to this day. So here then we get the idea of the ruler not just avoiding evil behavior, but actually having a responsibility to his people to care for them. And this becomes a trope that I think is essential to the idea of rulership in China throughout its history, and even today. He said it continued to his day. Well, I think it continues today, to this day. And what happens then is that you get the question, which is, what is it to be father and mother of the people? And this becomes the way that Mozi and the Ru, or the Confucianists, discuss rulership. And this is how the argument about political ethics takes place. That is to say, how do you be father and mother of the people? That's what the king should be. And so there's some, the term father and mother of the people is a very general term. In other words, turns into one that becomes the basis of philosophical speculation. So the term actually does first occur in the Book of Songs, as later Confucian tradition has it. So this is from a bamboo slip manuscript that's called by the transcribers Minter Fumu. It's in the Shanghai collection, so maybe buried around 300 BC. Zixia asked Confucius, the songs say, joyful is the prince, he is father and mother of the people, Minter Fumu. I presume to ask, what should somebody be like to be considered a father and mother of the people? And this question, there are actually two different songs in the Shijing that use the term Minter Fumu, and both are referred to in the later texts. And so it's also typical of the Confucian tradition that the shi plays this role as something that people refer to. So this particular song from the Daya that says Kai Ti or Qi Di Junzi Minter Fumu, it starts with that, and then they say, what does it mean to be father and mother of people? But then also, you don't need to say the Shijing, you just say, what does it mean to be father and mother of people? And for example, you find in Mencius, this famous thing from Liang Huiwang, Mencius said the kitchen has fatty meat and the stables have plump horses. The people have hungry appearance, and in the wild there are starved corpses. This is leading animals and eating people. When animals eat one another, people find it disgusting. To be father and mother of the people and to conduct government and to not avoid leading animals and eating people, how is this acting as father and mother of the people? In other words, everybody has assumed that that is the role that you should be, that the king should have, to be father and mother of the people, but his people are starving and all the grain is being used to fatten his animals and to give him his horses in particular, and to fatten his animals for meat that he can eat himself, whereas people are starving. That is the opposite of being father and mother of people. His responsibility is to make sure that people have the grain to eat and that they are able to mourn their parents. Those are the two things, in fact, that are usually taken as the sine qua non, as we just heard about, of a king's role, that people should be able to eat, that old people shouldn't have to work hard, and that people should be able to mourn their dead. But what we get is a working out of what being father and mother people is. Now, the term father and mother people does not occur in the text that Yuri was talking about, the Shangzhen Shu and the Hanfeizi. On the other hand, if you look at those texts and what the king is being advised to do, it's pretty much the same thing. That is to say that the king is responsible for the people's welfare. So even though they're not stressing the familial relations of the ruler to the people, it's still implied. That is what a ruler has to do. And of course, it's also practical in the sense that they will rebel if they don't have it. And you have in these foreign states texts, it's obvious that they were often faced with rebellions of people. And they did sometimes even overthrow kings of these states. So this then is the basis of Chinese political philosophy, that as I see it, that this is how or theory of rulership, let's put it that way, how to act in this way. So we started out with one king who's called Wang, and he was appointed by Shangdi, Tian, to act as its son, the son of sky heaven, and to rule all under the sky, Tianxia. These are, of course, terms that have lasted. The rule was hereditary, but is dependent on ritual propriety and the personal morality of the ruler, as well as his ability to care for the people. And his ability to care for the people is understood as the son of sky heaven being the father and mother of the people. And then philosophical debate centers around how one should act to be father and mother of the people. The first two things are still a problem when you look at the Chinese tradition and you try to apply it today, because it implies lineage rule, and that creates certain issues. But I think, and that's too big a story to go into, but I think it's important to see how this developed and to see that the idea of the ruler and its responsibility to the people is something that's still taken very seriously, and is probably still at the basis of the discussion about what a ruler should be. It's also probably on the basis of many of the things that are censored in China, in that it's where that responsibility might appear not to be taken with enough seriousness. That's all. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. Thank you. So we can take questions now. Yuri, there you go. You were the quickest. Please.
Yes. Sarah, thank you very much. It was a brilliant talk. And, you know, you're absolutely right, of course. Hanfei and Changyang also are very paternalistic, and Hanfei explicitly considers people like
Can you speak
small
up a little
children.
bit? I can't quite hear.
Yes, is it okay now? When I speak now, is it okay?
Yeah, it's better now.
Okay. So first of all, I admire your talk, and I think you are completely right. Both Changyang and Hanfei also support the paternalistic paradigm, and Hanfei specifically speaks about the people as children. So it's very, very clear. I think that you have a key for what I once maybe, if I want to write once more about political culture of traditional China and its modern relevance, would like to address the paternalism. I think is much better paradigm to understand Chinese political system than even meritocracy. It is something very deeply inside, which Mao actually was the only leader who tried to take it out and make the people acting somehow on themselves as unruly children. And then after Mao, China returned back to more paternalistic mode of rule. And I think that you are absolutely brilliantly put it. So very much thank you for this. One small point which may be worth of further debate is when the idea of the mandate of heaven started losing its popularity. I think now we have more indications that it happened already in the springs and autumns period. We have so many bronzes in which they mention Tianming, but never in the context of the universal rule of the draw. It becomes the mandate of Qin, the mandate of Jin, the mandate of Chu, the mandate of Wu, but never the universal rule. It is a kind of the first step toward transformation that you outlined very well for the warring state. So I think it began a little bit earlier, but it is just a very minor footnote. And thank you very much again. I think it's a brilliant paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuri. More questions or comments, follow up? Anyone? Okay, then maybe I can just, well, I can just say that it was a wonderful talk. It was very clear, all this evolution that you showed so in such a complete picture. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that you would normally expect maybe the tianzi to be just the father of the people. I'm always very much intrigued by this Mu being part of the picture, because normally you would not think, I see that there's a question, so well, maybe we can address this shortly, and then I will leave the floor also to other people. But I'm always intrigued by this, because later on it seems to be more focused, of course, on the father, which would be more consistent with a certain narrative, which we would expect. But I really like this aspect that it's there, especially in the manuscripts, actually, of the both components. So there is really this idea of family that develops at this stage. Then I also see one question in the comments, so I will not take more time. I see questions are coming, so I will then leave the floor to others. But I think first there was Giancarlo.
Hello, many thanks for this inspiring, elucidating, and fascinating talk. I am preparing to publish an article on the concept of tianxia and the proposal to apply it kind of to the whole world as a fundament of a new world order, which is the idea propagated by Zhao Tingyang and others. And I have always been asking myself about the aura of the term tian. And in this connection, your talk has been very helpful, extremely helpful. Because I believe that when proposing an old concept as the foundation of a new world order, an old concept that has a long history, unilaterally, of course. This is very peculiar because this could be kind of a very old speech act that the whole world could be subjugated into. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, it's hard to, the problem with, one essential problem with applying it today, as opposed to applying the techniques today. The techniques are something like, the road systems and such that all lead to China, is that the idea of tianzi, the idea of the appointment of the ruler, that is a problem. I mean, nobody is claiming to be tianzi.
Yes.
As far as I know. I don't read modern political. I'm a very amateur observer of modern China, so I don't read that what people are saying today about tianxia and such. But the grounds for rulership and the grounds for for taking that position are not quite clear to me. And that is to say, if one is tianzi, one by definition, one can say one by definition rules tianxia. But you have to be tianzi. So there's not. So the problem, I think, is that there is a residual resistance to adopting Western political ideology as at the center of the debate. On the other hand, they don't appear to have come up with any truly China-centered universal theory that one could apply today. They might, but at the moment, as far as I know, they haven't. But I don't really know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And then we have Professor Darrow, and then I have one question from Prabhat Kumar in the chat. So Professor Darrow, would you like to go ahead?
Okay, yes. Thank you. Thank you for the talk, and thanks to everyone for the whole conference, the part I've been able to get up for in North America. Now, my question is just this: if tianzi and Minti Fumu were both sort of terms for the emperor, I'm just struck thinking about the late imperial era that, of course, there's only one tianzi, but then the term Fumu Guan becomes extremely widespread and basically refers to all of the local officials that will be called that. Just struck by that, and if you have any thoughts on that, how the term then evolves over centuries.
The term, I'm sorry, the second term was, I didn't quite hear.
Fumu Guan
Oh, Fumuguan. Yeah. Well,
officials.
yeah. I mean, Fumu just means a parent.
Mhm.
So, or parents. And back to Lisa's observation, thing. I think there's an emphasis on the mu in the sense that the mu is nurturing, and that's probably implied in that. But tianzi is used as the appointed son, and therefore there's only one. On the other hand, the founders of the 3D were all supposed to be tianzi, the Yaoxuan, and they all had miraculous births by eating a bird's egg or stepping on a footprint or eating Job's tears. So technically, Tian had more than one zi, but politically, there's one zi at a time. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I'm not sure what the implication. So Fumu, it's that the thing about being Fumu is that you're means you're Fumu, but all officials also have the same role. I mean, should have that same role. Any official should act as the Fumu of the people that they govern, as I understand it, in the bureaucratized system. But remember that they weren't emperors until the Han Dynasty. But then the Han Dynasty, then they called themselves Huangdi. And as I've argued, that Huangdi is in fact a claim to rule both heaven and earth. And so there's another switch that happens when the rulers of the states go from Wang to calling themselves Di, Qin Wang Di. He was Wang Di. And I think that was a grander claim than just being ruler of the earth, to one that meant he was ruler of the cosmos.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that was actually probably basically exhaust the next question from Prabhat Kumar. I have one question where Huangdi fits in this narrative. That was exactly what you were saying right now. So precisely, very timely. And if there are more questions or comments or follow-up for Professor Allan. Otherwise, well, I profit a little bit to hear a bit more about that has always fascinated me in these evolutions that it has from this kind of power or virtus that it has during the Shang, and it's connected with also potentially this religious aspect of the ruler, and when is it exactly that it changes during the Zhou with the development of the mandate, or we still see somehow this kind of echo of this different conception of even in later texts that somehow coexist with the moral interpretation. So I'm very much interested in hearing more from you about
we don't know whether they had a concept of There's some argument about that, and I don't myself think that there's any record of it. It doesn't mean that it wasn't there, but in the bronze inscriptions, it's clear that it was hereditary. So they're always saying the of your ancestors. You have to respect the of your ancestors, and it seems to have originated as something like a charismatic power, and it seems to be what people's may differ, and it may be more powerful among some people than other people. And this goes back to another talk that we heard this morning or afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are. But so And Angus Graham very famously said that that its virtue is like the virtue of cyanide is to poison. So it's the essence of something, and it goes then, I think, somehow from being the example of these good kings or what that had the to being a term that's used in a moral sense. And then that that you inherited from your ancestors is deteriorated, and then you lose the rule. And then that's part of the insertion of the moral imperative into the passage of rule. That's how I understand it anyway.
Do you think so? Would it be possible that it's linked also with this development of these narratives about abdication to a certain extent? Because then you can, if you abdicate, then you of course cannot inherit anymore. So it should assume some different connotation somehow to justify the fact that these people should have some kind of powerful, virtuous element in them, but of course it cannot be hereditary anymore, of course.
Yeah, because their own sons were bad.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know how they worked that one out, or if the people who are arguing for abdication, I mean, if you take Moza as the closest you would get to that, then he would be, he says everybody's brother is like your brother. So he extends the family structure out. On the other hand, I think another important thing to think about in terms of usage terms like egalitarianism and such is that you, in Chinese language, you always have a sheng and a di. You don't have a brother. It's always going to be older or younger, or in the same with sisters. So that linguistically, the hierarchy is projected in there. I think we got some questions.
Yeah, exactly. Professor Taojiang, please go ahead.
Can you hear?
Yes, yes, please.
Yes. Thank you so much. This is just wonderful. I have a question looking at the last slide of Professor Allan's presentation. I think when you were presenting the sort of the development of the terminology, at least from the tianzi to the Minzi Fumu, it's sort of, you seem to be following the sort of saying that's almost kind of the logical sort of entailment. If this is the ruler, then it's, it eventually evolved into the idea of that the ruler as the Son of Heaven becomes the parents of the people. I wonder whether there's also sort of a historical sort of juncture in the way that the Minzi Fumu happened, and sort of you identify Mozi and then the discussion in the between Confucius and his disciples, and so forth during the Warring States about the idea that picked up this uptake on the Minzi Fumu. I wonder whether there's a shift. So if the emphasis early on was really on the relationship between the ruler and the heaven, and then now it seems to redirect towards the people, or am I making too much out of that?
No, I think that's true. I think that probably Minzi Fumu was implicit in the beginning, although, and it probably, at least in Western Zhou times, is implicit, at least if we understand that the Sui Gongxu or Ming or Bing Gongxu as I have. On the other hand, people were not discussing the responsibility of the ruler in the same way, but he did have those responsibilities. I mean, even in Neolithic times, rulers were collecting grain that they distributed. So, and once you have a bureaucracy of the types that they had to feed people, and other things. So it's there. And then what I think happens though is once people start to discuss how a ruler should act, and that kind of discussion, I mean, in general, as a philosophical problem, then that's the aspect that they concentrate on, because that's their literati, that's what they can advise about. They expand this moral problem. And at that time, they start to also, talk about very abstract problems. Is clear from the bamboo manuscripts, like what is a human, that sort of thing too. But it's not. It seems to me it's sort of all there, but the shift is really in the emphasis that
Right.
Any king at any time would realize that the basis of his power was that the people have to obey him or do what he wants for them. And you see the Shang king is just seems to be terrified of Shangdi punishing him and his people. So he is taking that responsibility. He's saying, the harvest is a harvest going. He's asking all the time whether the harvest is going to succeed, and if it's not succeeding, what do you need from me? So, what sacrifices should I give? So he's acting as a conduit to the spirits, and the blame goes on this, to the spirits would come down to the people. So he is, in a sense, he's acting as that conduit. He's acting on behalf of not just his lineage. He's acting on behalf of everybody that he has control over. We need rain. They're locusts or whatever there is, and then his responsibility is to talk to Shangdi and give him, sacrifices that he needs and whatever else he needs, and so that he will ensure the well-being of the Sifang, and the Sifang is equivalent of Tianxia, the four quadrants, as I call them. So he's got everything. He's not, the term Tian isn't being used, but Sifang is being used. And there's only one Shangdi. So it's implicit, and then it becomes the basis of philosophical argument. That's essentially what I'm arguing.
Right. So you're saying that it's, that's all there at the beginning, albeit in a more implicit form. Then it's sort of the later development of kind of working out its intellectual sort of entailments, and when more people, bureaucrats and intellectuals, were debating on those, rather than seeing that there's actually a shift in terms of orientation for, in that at all.
That's right. Yeah, I see it as more that that the argument changes because you're not concerned so much with Shangdi's punishment as you are, although those rituals are still being practiced, and those are still the responsibility of the ruler, but there is also a level of agnosticism of the powers of the spirits amongst people in the Warring States period. So there is a shift, but it's framed by the language tradition. And that was also part of my point, is that you can't really, you do need to understand, and that's why I was putting it in the beyond Orientalism context. You do need to understand how these things developed in order to understand what their implications are.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions or comments? Okay, I see there are no more urgent questions, and I'm sure Professor Allan will be happy to answer any additional questions you might have also afterwards via email. So I think we can thank Professor Allan for being with us, and we can conclude on this high note with this beautiful talk and conclude this long day for some of us. So I would like to thank, of course, Professor Allan, our speakers, our discussants, of course, Federico, who has been organizing this with me, and of course, Hilde, who gave the first keynote lecture and is still with us. Kudos to you for sticking with us throughout the whole day. So I thank you all. I hope most of you will be able to join us tomorrow. The link you have works also for all the talks tomorrow, so feel free to jump in whenever you have time.